So I too would like to welcome each and every one of you on this very hot and sultry evening. You're good to come out in this kind of condition. But I thank you for coming and for coming to this third talk in our series of 7 different talks on the history of Bristol and Bristol people and Bristol places. But it's a great honor to introduce to you Jim Lyon. Jim and I go way back. We were classmates at Bowdoin College. We actually both played soccer on the Bowdoin soccer team. So, in any event, Jim has been coming to Maine almost all of his life, of course, and first started coming to the area of Long Cove Point in the 40s when he was a little toddler. But his grandparents first started coming in the 30s and purchased land, and that's where their house there on Long Cove Point began. But Jim has been a member of the Archives Committee of the Long Cove Point Association, and he is currently working with John Neff, who of course wrote that very lovely book entitled A Witness to History, The Story of Long Cove. And Jim and John are now updating that book because it was originally written in 1996. So would you join with me now in giving a warm welcome to Jim Lyon.
Thank you, Bob, and it certainly is a warm welcome, I've got to say. I thought I'd start off with an existential question, that is, where is Chamberlain? And this is the current Boothbay Region Discovery Map. And if you look between New Harbor and Round Pond, where Chamberlain should be, you'll discover that it's not there. But not being on the tourist map is maybe not so bad a thing after all. Chamberlain has a post office and a zip code, so you'd think the Postal Service would know where Chamberlain was. Well, there's a little bit of Round Pond that's mysteriously in the middle of things. And then Rebecca Bell, a couple of years ago, bought a house down in this area here, which you'd think would be in the middle of Chamberlain, except that she was given a choice whether she wanted a Round Pond or a Chamberlain address. So, what I'm going to use for a working definition is to go from Salt Pond to Brown's Head up here, which is just before Brown's Cove, and then along Route 32, pretty much everything east of Route 32, and then half a mile west, which was the original membership boundary for the Long Cove Point Association for membership. So that's what I'm going to call Chamberlain. Now for history. 1815 was a watershed year for Bristol. The wars were over, but the real estate situation was a mess. There were grants and charters from colonial days, deeds with Indians, a group of great proprietors in Boston who claimed to be inheritors of all of that and owned everything. Meanwhile, the people who were actually living here were predominantly descendants of the Scots-Irish who had come about a century earlier with the promise that they'd be able to own their own land when they got here. 1813, the Massachusetts legislature, after more politics than you can imagine, decided that in 9 towns in the eastern lands, which was Maine, all of the previous claims would be thrown out. It would be taken over by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts would then turn around and sell deeds to the settlers at affordable rates. What followed on that was an 1815 survey, which covered all of Bristol at the time. Bristol at the time included Bremen, South Bristol, parts of Noblesboro, parts of Damariscotta. So this was a massive undertaking. Finished in 1815 by William McClintock. What we find is that Long Cove Point over here has ears of Patrick trains. In a huge thing like this, errors are bound to creep in, and it's actually Patrick Train. Now, as someone who's been called Lyons all my life, I can appreciate that problem, but it should be Patrick Train. This is actually James Hackleton. The Hackleton Farm was on the west side of the cove, and Will Rogers owned this area here. Very shortly after that 1815 survey was completed, some representatives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts came around selling the land to the settlers. So Lot 34, which was Long Cove Point, went to the heirs of Patrick Train. Lot number 35 to Benjamin Tukey in his own name. Benjamin was also one of the heirs of Patrick. $5.41 for 42 acres, which worked out to about 13 cents an acre, which was affordable. The Tukey family plays a large role in Chamberlain, so let's meet the Tukeys. The best information I have is that John Tukey arrived in Falmouth, which is now Portland, in 1744. And his father, also named John Tukey, probably came from England to Malden, Massachusetts, where John Tukey came to Falmouth from. He married and had a son by the name of Benjamin Tukey. Benjamin is famous in the history of Portland for standing too close to a cannon that discharged prematurely during the celebrations of the victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. About a month later, he passed away, and his young widow and his son, also named Benjamin, they loved the name Benjamin, it appears all over the place, they somehow made their way to Newcastle. And when Benjamin was in Newcastle, he somehow met Polly Train, who was the daughter of Patrick Train, married her, and therefore became the one of the heirs of Patrick Train, inheriting Long Cove Point. He apparently bought out the other heirs somehow. They had 8 children. Patrick here is the one that'll show up in the next thrilling episode of All My Tukeys. 1857, this is the Hopkins Map, which many of you have seen. It's all over the place. There's one at Shaw's Wharf. And what we find on that is Captain S. Tukey, Captain P. Tukey, and Captain B. Tukey. That's Samuel, Patrick, and Benjamin living near Long Cove Point. The Hackletons had the farm across the way. The Tukeys are all captains, so apparently they had something to do with the sea as well as farming. They had a sheep pasture out on Long Cove Point, among their many other endeavors.
At the end of the 19th century, the economy of Bristol and Maine was in decline. Everything went elsewhere. Railroads opened up farming in the west and replaced coastal shipping. Quarrying and brickmaking could be done more efficiently somewhere else. Refrigeration killed the ice industry. Even the fish went elsewhere. So they decided that tourism was the ticket. Chamberlain is a result of the tourism decision. And it turns out that a good way to tell the origin story of Chamberlain is with surveys.
July 2nd, 1888. This is David Chamberlain and his son Henry. They surveyed down at Pemaquid Point here. This is the end of the point. The loop road would be around in here. Lighthouse is here. Pemaquid Hotel would be in this area here. They surveyed 331 cottage lots in that area. The standard dimension was 4 rods by 6 rods, which is like 66 feet by 99 feet. And what it reminded me of was a sign that you used to find on your way into Maine in Kittery, They packed them in like sardines. Turned out not to be that great an idea because I think the last lot sold sometime in the 1960s. People would buy lots around on the shore with the water view and everything, but a tiny lot back in the woods, not that appealing. David Chamberlain and Son, again, did a survey in 1894, a few years later, down on what is now Salt Pond Point. This is a little tough to follow because they put north down at the bottom here. But take my word for it, it's the area that's now Salt Pond Point, and it was surveyed by for the Danforths. The Danforths owned a farm in New Harbor. The farmhouse and barn became Gosnold Arms. So they were right up above the wharf where the steamboats came in. And so they saw all this going on and they figured they wanted to get in on the action and did their own little survey down of Danforth Point. David Chamberlain and Son are at it again in 1896. And this is where they get to Long Cove Point. One of the good things about Long Cove Point was that the geography sort of prevented them from packing things in. This is basically ledge all up in here. And so they did lots around the edges. It included one lot which had already been sold to some people from Whitefield in 1889 who built a fishing camp. The Tukeys figured, with all this activity going on and the people interested in a fishing camp, let's go for it and survey the whole point. By 1904, there were already 6 little cottages out at the end of the point and 2 more in the survey area. Lot number 1 was the Greenwood cottage. Some people by the name of Greenwood who weren't shy about announcing their presence built that lovely cottage. One thing, I don't know whether you can see from the back of the room, but this has got to be the world's most luxurious hammock. The other side of the cove is pretty much still farmland, a couple of farm buildings.
Is that Alfred Ring's cottage there?
Yes. Yeah. Yep, that's what became it's now Shepherd's cottage, and still there and still looks very much like it did then.
What year was that?
The picture was around 1905. The construction of the cottage was probably a couple of years before that. This is out at the end of the point, postcard that you folks may have seen. The earliest postmark we have on it is 1909. It was colorized from a picture from 1908, so it's at least 1908 when all of these little cottages are already out there. A couple of years ago, David Chamberlain's Surveyor's Notebook came up on eBay. And unfortunately, I discovered that after it had been sold. I've tracked down an antiques dealer in Wiscasset who had sold it and tried to figure out who he sold it to, and he was sort of vague and didn't have records and so forth. I don't know whether he thought I was from the IRS or what, but Water Street Antiques, in case you're interested. If anybody here bought that, I'd love to see it. So it's 7.5 by 4.5 inches folded. It opens into 3 sections. I thought when I looked at the surveys originally that they were done with like a pencil and a ruler, but it turns out he had a brass protractor. And it also mentions on this page that he's referencing the William McClintock Survey, the 1815 survey. About that 1815 survey, it turns out it's not registered in Wiscasset. The only copy they have there is something called Map 159 Bristol in a drawer called Contributions to the Registry. And the copy says, copied in 1960 by Elanka Fertig. Well, Alanka Fertig was very big in history around here. She sort of single-handedly saved the Harrington Meeting House and was very interested in history. But I don't know, at least, what she copied it from. And there's another copy floating around that was also copied apparently from the same thing, but it has differences on it, and they got the selectmen wrong. The handwriting in those days was pretty undecipherable, but the second party that copied this turned John Fawcett into John Tappeth, and Henry Hunter into Henry Manter. So if anybody can track down the original survey or go further upstream on this thing, the 1815 survey is a crucial document in Bristol history. All the deeds and everything flow from that, and it's not registered apparently. Meanwhile, back with the Tukeys. Remember Patrick. He bought out his siblings in the 1860s, so he owned the whole Point area at that point. And then 3 of his children, Eldridge, Augustine, and Rosetta, were involved in the development of Long Cove Point from the survey. Now, Augustine's family involves some people that people here may still remember. Minnie Tukey, Walter Tukey, Arthur and Louise, and the Chamberlain Post Office are all part of Augustine Tukey's family. Augustine Tukey's house was built in 1879. This is where Route 32 what became Route 32 used to come and make a right-angle turn to go down the shore. That house, the basic house, is still there. There's now a huge porch kind of thing fronting where Route 32 is now, since it was cut off on this right-angle corner. This was the original post office. It started off as a store, and then when we got a post office, they turned it into a post office and a store.
So that was Arthur and Louise's house. Arthur and Louise Tukey.
Yeah, that's where they lived, and that's where Augustine and then Walter and Minnie and then Arthur and Louise lived. This is some of Augustine's family. This is Minnie, Gus, who worked over at Hannah's Garage, a very young Arthur Tukey. This is Walter. This is Dorothea Sanger, who became Dorothea Royal, photobombing that one. Now, Eldridge's family was, there were more of them, and Eldridge moved to Malden, Massachusetts, and ran a store there. But for now, it's enough to say that there's nobody with the Tukey name still at Chamberlain, but the Tukey DNA lives on in the Stebbins and Sheridan families, some of whom are here today.
Eldridge was Sally's great-grandfather.
Yeah, we have a picture of Sally coming up here too. Chamberlain was pretty darn successful. There were cottages were built and people started coming and all that, compared to some of these other developments. And I got to wondering, who was the salesman? And I'm pretty sure it was Eldridge, because in 1924, the club published their bylaws and had a list of membership in the back. 30% of the membership came from Malden, Massachusetts. So he was a busy guy. His son, Rawson's daughter, Olive McIntyre, who some old-timers may remember. There's a very young Sally Stebbins, the great-granddaughter, with Nelson Shaw, who we'll meet again. 1903, David Chamberlain had passed in 1900, and Henry Chamberlain continued the surveying. This is over on the other side of the cove, the west side. George Little had 27 lots. Again, they're the small size. These are 66 feet across. It turns out the ones along the water sold. The ones back inland did not. This is Henry Hunter Chamberlain, who was quite a guy. The Chamberlains were sort of the aristocracy of Round Pond at the time. The Chamberlain B&B along Route 32 is the Chamberlain House. There's a Chamberlain Cemetery across the road. Henry Chamberlain was a member of the Maine House of Representatives and Senate. He was president of the Board of Trustees of Lincoln Academy. He was Justice of the Peace, you name it. He was also not shy about putting his name on things. The three-masted schooner there is the H.H. Chamberlain, which he invested in at the end of the 1800s. He also is the one who ended up with his name on the post office. He was instrumental in getting the post office for the summer colony, and they wanted to call it Long Cove, but that was already taken. There was a Long Cove. There are many Long Coves, but there was already a Long Cove post office up between St. George and Tennant's Harbor, down from Thomaston, and that was a very active quarrying operation before our Chamberlain got started, our Long Cove. This formidable woman is Katharina Eastwood. She was born in England in 1863, married in Boston in 1904, and was heavily into vacant lot gardening. This photograph comes from the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, which awarded her a gold medal in 1930, so I got a picture of. In 1923, she surveyed 16 cottage lots along the west side of the cove, just north of where George Little had surveyed. The backstory of that is that in 1911, Herman Danforth, who was the son of the Danforths of New Harbor, convinced the town of Bristol to put through a shore road. Prior to that, the Long Cove Road went back inland through the Hackleton Farm. And you'll still see a sign that says Old Long Cove Road up by the ball field where the Hardy boat parking is now, and the road makes a right angle turn. So the road went from there to Chamberlain back through the woods. Well, Herman decided it would be a lot nicer if they had a road along the shore. And by the way, Chamberlain was booming. That was a successful thing. Danforth Point, not so much. It turns out that road wound its way through Danforth Point on its way to Chamberlain. In the 60s, they cut off that part. So now it's Salt Pond Road that is off Route 32. But in the original days, you had to go through Danforth Point on your way to Chamberlain if you came into New Harbor or Pemaquid or someplace, and it was a carriage ride, so you had plenty of time to, look around and check out Danforth Point. Today, there were 9 lots along George Little's waterfront. There are 4 cottages there today, and lots have been combined. On Katharina's 16 lots, there are 11 cottages today. 1925, this is the Atlantic Heights development, which is sort of back in the woods. Ralph Files, who was from Fairfield, Maine, and a couple of other partners, which included Harry Brown of the Emery Brown department store in Waterville, and Walton Hendry, who was from Washington, D.C., went in on this Atlantic Heights development in 1925. Katharina had such a big success along the shore that she decided to do the other side of the road and go back inland, but small lots back in the woods, guess what happens? Also, it was surveyed in 1928. They didn't file the survey until 1929, just in time for the Great Depression to hit. And so that side of the road remained largely undeveloped for a long time. So put that all together, and the origin story of Chamberlain is basically a tale of 5 surveys, all done before the end of the 20s and pretty much covering the waterfront here. The areas that are blank or weren't surveyed, the Tukeys kept that down at that end. Walton Hendry, one of the partners of Atlantic Heights, kept that area.
Ralph
Files, another partner in Atlantic Heights, built cabins along here. Question?
One thing I didn't understand exactly, you said they surveyed it. Is that like subdividing it, a piece of land into one big piece into little pieces so they could sell them?
Yeah, when you do a survey, you take a big plot of land that belongs to somebody and you divide it up into little lots, or at least that was what was going on here. And then the idea was they'd sell the little lots to individuals. And so that's the survey story. Long Cove Point Association was formed in 1908 for building and maintaining for the summer residents of said Long Cove Point a clubhouse, a float for boats, and other things of similar nature necessary for the purpose of promoting the enjoyment and social life of said summer residents. It turns out they did have some year-round residents. Will Carter, whose name appears down here, lived in Chamberlain year-round and did a lot of building in the area. The Tukeys were also active members, so it wasn't exclusively summer residents. And one interesting thing on the certificate of organization, the Justice of the Peace is Henry Hunter Chamberlain. Strikes again. 1910, Eldridge Tukey deeded a lot just to the north of the Long Cove Point development to the association to build a clubhouse. He wanted it 35 feet back from the road though, so it wouldn't obstruct his view. He lived down at the end of the cove. So the only thing in that 35 feet was to be lawn and an access road. 1910, right after the deed, they very quickly built a clubhouse. Will Carter constructed that. The same basic building is there even today. So it was well built and functional. Here's Will. Some of his descendants are still around the cove, the Grahams. 1924, the basic building had a kitchen added in 1916 and a porch added in 1923. The building there looks pretty much the way it does today. You would recognize it. The only differences are a tennis court, which came later, and electricity, which we'll see in a moment. 1925, another lot next to the first lot, but they could build a tennis court in that 35 feet. So in 1933, they ended up building a tennis court. This is a picture around 1935 where you got the tennis court and also poles for electric power. Electricity came to the point in 1925. You can imagine what life was like before electricity. This is in front of the club. The parking situation has always been an issue on Long Cove Point. In 1962, Olive McIntyre, who was Rawson's daughter and Eldridge's granddaughter, needed 154 feet of land for parking, basically. And one interesting thing there is it extended to the low water mark. Well, if you know Long Cove, low water is like the sandbar. So, does it go all the way across to the other shore? I don't know. Trivia time. Does anyone know what deltiology is? And?
Of a river? Change.
Well, it turns out that's the technical term for the collecting of postcards. It was a new one on me. And also I discovered that there's a whole subculture of postcard collectors that I was totally unaware of. Gary Llewellyn from Chamberlain has an extensive collection. Before 1907 now, it turns out that the only thing you could put on the back of a postcard was the address. So if you had a picture postcard, you'd have to write in the margins or spoil the picture or something like that. 1907, the Postal Service decided they'd allow a split back. That is, you could put the address and a message. Well, the picture postcard market took off. It was like the social media of the day. This, you know, the one you saw earlier with the cottages at the end of the point. This is the 1908 black and white version. 1909 colorized version. It turns out they sent cards to Germany to be colorized. Germany had the most advanced color technology of the day, and so early postcards that are colorized, you'll find, were done in Germany. A few years later, they put in a tariff on that, and World War I came along, and that ended. But for one brief shining moment around 1910 or so, you get these beautiful German colorized postcards, some of which are pretty imaginative. The people that colorized them had never been to Maine, so they sort of made up colors. But anyway, the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company was big and provides a lot of the record for this area. It was founded in Belfast, Maine, 1909 by Herman Cassens, this fellow here, and they sent these little specially equipped cars around. The photographers would take a bunch of pictures in a little community. They'd send them back to Belfast to be developed. Herman had great ambitions, Maine to California. He was going to go all the way with these postcards. He made it as far as Western New York, but nevertheless, it gave us a wonderful photographic record of our area. They didn't keep particularly good records, but within a photo shoot, you'd have a consecutive number system. And we were able to find all 13 of what was apparently their first trip to Chamberlain in probably 1910. It could have been 1911. The first postmark is July of 1911, but based on what's in the pictures, like the clubhouse, which was built in 1910, is there. This is Eldridge Tukey's house that he wanted the unobstructed view out to the ocean from.
Casino.
Yeah, they called it a casino. My guess is that they had been to Christmas Cove, and the Christmas Cove clubhouse was called a casino, and it was built a couple of years before Chamberlain's. Chamberlain's at that time was still brand new, and they probably didn't have the sign on it yet or anything. So the folks at Belfast called it or the photographer or whoever called it a casino. The lettering on these things, incidentally, these are what's called
Real photo
postcards, RPPCs. You'll find them all over eBay, and they were glass 5x7 glass negatives that they would develop right onto postcard stock. And so what they did was they'd write in black lettering on the negative backwards what it was, and then when it was developed it would come out white forwards, but often at strange angles on the resulting card. They arrived at low tide, unfortunately, but that's looking out toward the point, the sandbar area. There's the clubhouse again, not called a casino this time. These cottages are there today, the Greiser's place, and the Conways. This was, interestingly enough, called the Malden Cottage. So this is going out further along the point. This is looking back across to the other side. There were two cottages there, so-called twin or Fairfield cottages. That was pretty much all there was on that side of the cove in 1910. They were at the end of a road that came from the old Long Cove Road down to the shore where the Hackletons, which the Hackletons had used to collect seaweed to fertilize their farmlands. Those cottages got built in the early 1900s at the end of that little road. It's before the shore road was cut through. This strange thing here, I have no idea what it is, but somebody's idea of creativity. Okay, this is looking back as they continued out around the point. This is the club again. This is Augustine Tukey's house, the little post office. This is out at the end of the point now, looking at the cottages that showed up in some of those other postcards that you saw, but from an odd angle because they couldn't get out. They couldn't get out on the point apparently with their equipment, so they just shot that one, looking up the back shore. But you can see things were already there. This is a scenic looking back toward New Harbor and the islands of Long Cove Point. This is coming back the road. Again, these cottages are still there, but just larger now. Okay, this is back at the Greenwoods cottage. A couple of interesting things on this one. First of all, the hammock is gone. The automobile turns out to be a 1910 Maxwell Roadster. And the driver is Nelson Shaw, who married one of Eldridge Tukey's daughters. I wondered, how on earth he got this car up here. He lived in Massachusetts. The predominant way of getting around was by steamboat. The roads were terrible. It turns out that Herman Casons of the Eastern Illustrating and Publishing Company owned a 1910 Maxwell Roadster. So I'm guessing that either Herman was the photographer or somebody he loaned it to. And this is like a staged shot that they hope people would find enough novelty in to buy that postcard. Okay, this is coming back along the road. This was where the original fishing camp, Whitefield Cottage, was located, and that cottage is still there today, just greatly expanded and painted yellow. It's the Elskis Cottage. And this is from the beach. Lots of boats in the cove, 1910. This is back at the post office. This is Augustine's house from another angle. The post office, which was founded in 1905, and you guessed it, the 1910 Maxwell Roadster with Cora Tukey Shaw and Minnie Tukey on board this time. One of the things about cars in that era was many of them had the steering wheel on the right. And the reason for that was it was more important to know where the edge of the road was than to deal with oncoming traffic, because there wasn't any oncoming traffic. Continuing with postcards, Arthur Merrill was also active. You'll probably recognize, he always put a copyright A.E. Merrill or AEM on his cards. He was a little more artistic in his treatment of things. This is the other side of the cove, the unpaved shore road. And this is over in New Harbor. That's the old Danforth farmhouse and barn, which is the brand new Gosnold Arms. This is like the mid-20s. It was converted in 1925, and this picture looks like it's right after that. Herman Casons was more of a businessman. He's reputed to have said that he could teach a salesman photography, but he couldn't teach a photographer to be a salesman. So he hired salesmen. Arthur Merrill was more of an artiste. Transportation and utilities. Getting there was not half the fun. A good way to talk about transportation is with a brochure. This is from Atlantic Heights. The 1925, the ill-fated 1925 development back in the woods. They had an extensive section on transportation. far from the crowded ways of life, yet easy of access. And the first, primary way of getting there was by private yacht. Second choice was steamship. Third choice was railroad, and then a connection to a steamboat. And last but not least was automobile. If one prefers to motor, the most beautiful and hard-surfaced road exists nearly all the way from Portland, which will bring the Heights within a 2 hours drive of that city when the new $3 million bridge at Bath is completed. You'll see a little bit more about that in a moment. It turns out there were no paved roads in Bristol in 1925. Steamship, Eastern Steamship Lines, Portland and Rockland Division came into New Harbor. It left Portland on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays heading north and went back on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If you left at 7 o'clock from Portland, you would get to New Harbor at 11:15, according to their schedule, for $1.25 one way and $2 round trip. The steamer MONHEGAN, which was what they used at that time, was famous in the world of postcards. There are lots of pictures of the MONHEGAN. These are the colorized ones from Germany. You'll notice it's a little fanciful when it comes to the colors. And a little steamboat trivia here. In the early days, steamboats had masts because people weren't really convinced about, these newfangled mechanical things. The masts were there in case, the engines failed, you could just hoist some sails and be on your way, so nothing to worry about, folks. However, by the later pictures, they'd taken down the masts. Apparently, everybody was comfortable with the idea of steamboats at that point. This is leaving New Harbor. This is the Danforth's farm. The Eastern Steamship Company also had a division where you could get on at Bath if you didn't want to get on in Portland, and it made its way on to Pemaquid Beach and Harbor over here. This is the Damariscotta
River Steamboat
Company. That was founded in 1900 by Elliott Gamage. A lot of this information is courtesy of Dave Andrews of the South Bristol Historical Society. He introduced me to this, and the boats would basically meet the train at the Damariscotta Newcastle station and then go down the river to South Bristol, and then you'd transfer to another boat to get to Pemaquid Beach or Harbor, and then you'd take a 4-mile carriage ride to get to Chamberlain. The little boat in that picture is the Anodyne. Dave owns Anodyne House over in South Bristol, which belonged to Elliott Gamage. Elliott Gamage, before he went legit and got into the Damariscotta Steamboat Company, chugged up and down the coast in this little boat called the Anodyne, selling something called Johnson's American Anodyne Liniment. This was marvelous stuff. It was concocted by a country physician, Abner Johnson, in 1810. And Maine was a dry state long before the Volstead Act and national prohibition. And it turns out Johnson's American Anodyne Liniment was pretty much mostly alcohol with just a dollop of morphine. So it would get you through the winter. But it came in small bottles, so you needed a lot of the stuff. It was originally concocted in 1810. That was so successful that they moved to Bangor. And then that was so successful that Abner's son moved the company to Boston, and they sold stuff nationally. But the great thing about this was you just basically changed the labeling for the disease du jour. If whooping cough was going around, that was the lead. Here's a package label. It's for diphtheria, coughs, colds, influenza, bronchitis, asthma, whooping cough, cramp and pain in the stomach, bowels, or side, rheumatism, spitting blood and all lung complaints, sore throat, spinal complaints, chronic diarrhea, dysentery, chapped hands, burns, wounds, sprains, and bruises. And it could be used both internally and externally. This was marvelous stuff, I tell you. Meanwhile, back with the Damariscotta Steamboat Company, they would come down the river. It was about a 2-hour trip coming down, about 2.5 hours going back, a little longer going back. You had to transfer to get over to Pemaquid Harbor. Anodyne was replaced by a larger boat called the Tourist, pictured here. And it turns out the Tourist is still in operation. It's the last coal-fired wooden steamboat in operation in the U.S. It's down at Mystic Seaport, and it was wrecked in 1918 in Damariscotta, but they refloated it, renamed it the Sabino, and it ran down in Massachusetts for a number of years, but then ended up at the Mystic Seaport. So if you're interested in what it was like, you know, these are coal-fired things. It took like a couple of hours to fire up the boiler, and you needed a professional engineer, and it wasn't easy. Here's the 1926 Rand McNally map, and the way I read it, there are no roads in Bristol that are paved. Also, this map shows Long Cove, which is up between St. George and Tennant's Harbor. No, the post office is no longer there, but you know, we're still Chamberlain. If you motored to Chamberlain, the big barrier was the Kennebec River. They even had to take trains across on ferries before the Carleton Bridge was finished in 1927. The ferry boat there would handle a maximum of 25 cars. So if you thought the backups at Wiscasset were bad, you know, think of the old days. The boat for cars was the Governor King. It turns out it's not Angus, but William King, who was the first governor of the state of Maine. The Hercules is the one for railroad cars. Okay, here's the grand opening for automobiles of the Carleton Bridge. Trains went down below. They started on October 24th, automobiles on November 15th, but they missed the 1927 tourist season. The bridge was dedicated officially on July 3rd, 1928, and of course, a couple of years later, the Depression, so poor timing. Water was an issue. Out on the point, there was one well, one community well that people would use. The pump was still there into the 1960s, and people would lug water to and fro, potable water from the town pump. So people would collect every precious ounce of fresh water that they could. Rain barrels, beer barrels, anything that would hold water got recruited into the process, and gutters would go everywhere to get this stuff. Also in those days they didn't have showers, so to fill up a bathtub took gallons and gallons of water, and everybody was very conscious of the water situation. This is cleaning a rain barrel in the 1940s. That's a 1,000-gallon tank. Cooking stoves were largely from the Wood and Bishop Stove Company of Bangor, Maine. Louisa Smith, who owned a cottage down at Chamberlain, was the heiress of the Wood and Bishop Wooden Stove Company fortune. They made a fortune because every cottage had one of these wooden cooking stoves. Chamberlain Post Office, 1905, Henry Chamberlain was instrumental in getting us a post office and getting his name on it. The first postmistress was Minnie Tukey, Augustine's daughter. She was 22 years old when she started. She was 70 years old when she was forced to retire in 1953. Some people may still remember Minnie. Her nephew, Arthur, took over when she retired, and he was there for 20 years. He retired early at age 64. Dana Small is the other long-serving postmaster at Chamberlain. He built that new post office building on the other side of the road. He also dealt in real estate. He was there until 2001 when he reached age 70 in the mandatory retirement. Since then, we've had a procession of temporary people from New Harbor and Lord knows what. Currently, we have a PSE, a Postal Support Employee, which doesn't sound good. There's been sort of a running battle about whether Chamberlain will keep a post office since the 1970s. It's a really nice post office. You know, if you need to buy stamps, stop by, pick them up there. If you want to send packages, anything to help us keep this post office. Okay, a couple of then and now shots and we're almost done. This was from that original pre-1907 postcard and what it looks like today. Not all that much difference. This was built in 1933, but the Greenwood Cottage, the Ring place, is still there, and the Tukey place. Okay, this is out at the end of the point, and the way it looked a few years ago when I was still able to climb out on the point without orthopedic assistance. You can see some of the same cottages just expanded. Over at Salt Pond, there was a dance hall called Salt Pond Park.
That's where her parents met at a dance.
Oh, okay.
And I just discovered pictures from 1916. Her grandfather built the Richmond Lodge that Carol bought.
Okay.
See it? It's on the ocean side. And there's a ton of pictures of life and goofing around in their 1920s bathing suits.
I would love to see that, and I'm sure Chuck would too.
Luckily, her dad, Millard Richmond, was a photographer, and the Historical Society has scanned millions of pictures. But we've just discovered more because I was interested in the Longcoat House. But your parents, Pauline and Millard, met at the dance hall, and we just ran into Jay Grace, who said that this gal Rebecca down.
Oh yeah, Rebecca Bell is here tonight.
And transported it over to her land.
Yeah, Laurel Hall it turns out that Chamberlain in the early days was basically bounded by two dance halls,
Right.
Salt Pond Park and Laurel Hall. Today it's the two nature preserves, Rachel Carson Salt Pond Preserve and the Laverna Preserve. So, you know, something's lost and something's gained, I guess. But we're now bounded by nature preserves. In the old days, it was dance halls. Okay, so you can find a lot of stuff on the Longco Point website, and there's historical sections and so forth. I'd love to see your book and scan stuff to add to the collections. And if there are any questions or answers or whatever, fire away.
There was a silent film shot in
New Harbor, right.
Yeah. That my grandmother had a poster from.
Okay.
Remember the name? Did you know about that at all?
Well, I know generally about that. I'm the Chamberlain guy. I found out there's enough stuff in Chamberlain to keep me occupied. I'm still working my way up the hill with things, but I'm sure the old Bristol historical folks
It was called The Seventh Day.
really be interested.
And you can actually find it on YouTube in segments, but only with Czech subtitles.
The silent era.
Yeah, it's, there was basically one copy preserved in like Czechoslovakia, and they now have a copy of it at the, I don't know what the,
In Bucksport.
Bucksport,
He had it shown once, even the show once, so it's great fun to watch. The upper point, Leather and New Harbor, seas back to back, you just almost just crack up.
Terrific.
I think my grandmother had a copy of it with no subtitles. Like, I don't know, it was a beta. I think it got
The Neff Lyon redo book come out.
Well, that's going a little slower than expected, but we're hoping to, with modern technology, in 1996 publishing was very different than it is today. And today you can have ebooks and you can have all sorts of stuff. And so, I'm hoping to get something out this year, but then, better editions as we move forward. And make it sort of a living thing too, because last year we had a drone, a guy with a drone show up, and I figured we should get something useful out of that. So on the club website, there's an aerial drone view flying down the cove and then going down the back shore. And 100 years from now, I think that will be of historical interest. So. It's an ongoing thing. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. And,